Don't adjust your screen settings because coming up on Worlds Asunder.
So, but for me, it always starts with a mathematical system, and I build the story later. So I'm never thinking, what tropes do I want? Except that when I write Dungeon Core, there are certain tropes. It's not even just a trope. There's like a story outline that is followed 85% of the way through every single story.
As storytellers, we want to capture the hearts, minds, and imaginations of our readers, mainly through our expertly crafted worlds.
Creating new worlds in any genre might seem like a daunting task, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every story.
Welcome, weary writers, to Worlds Asunder, a world-building and writer's life podcast.
My co-host is David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's H.Y. Gregor, or you can call her Haley, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
Together, we've got enough published to fill a small shelf, but why should you listen to us? Because we called in some favors.
Every other week, we bring you the best and brightest to give you the tips and tricks on world building and character building like the pros. So, open up your ear holes.
Get out your pen and paper.
And get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder. The next few weeks, we're taking you into LitRPG and Progression Fantasy with Gotta Get Stronger, Part 1, John and Shami Stovall.
Welcome back to Worlds Asunder, the only podcast on the internet that's giving you arguments about games that nobody cares about anymore, and world building in the same instance. That's a reference to an off-screen conversation we've already had, and I'm sure it'll come back around at some point. But as always, I am your host, Shady David Shadoin. It's both a moniker and a descriptor. This week I'm not coming to you near as hungry as I did probably in one of the previous episodes where I mentioned it. My co-host, as always, is Haley H.Y. Gregor. She's still working on whatever her gimmick's going to be. Besides post-apocalyptic wasteland elf. I don't know.
I'm waiting for you to come up with something for me.
Oh, I have to be the clever one constantly. Got it. Shots fired. With us today, who are just witnessing us going back and forth at each other. But they're here more to actually give you guys some good info. With us today, we have two awesome guests, some of our favorite people to hang out with, to game with, board game with so far, and discuss all things writing and gaming. First up, she loves telling stories, playing video games, reading, and writing about herself in the third person. As an author, nothing gives her more pleasure than hearing others enjoy her work. So here's hoping those of you who read find something you enjoy from her. She has a BA in history and a JD from the Lawrence Driven School of Law. She'll correct me on that later, I'm sure. As a child, her favorite novel was The Island of Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, and it helped open up her imagination to possibilities she had never considered. And to this day, she can still remember the impact it had on her. It's Shami Stovall. Shami, thanks for coming.
Yeah,
And
no problem.
he loves Shami, gaming, reading, math, his friends, his family, and his dog. Probably a whole lot of other things he can't think of right now. He got his BA in political science and a JD from Humphrey's School of Law, but his real passion lies in writing. When he isn't thinking up number systems for his own homebrew Dungeons and Dragons game, he's thinking up cool plot lines for his books. If you'd like to contact him, you could call him John Stovall. John, also thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So you guys both write in Progression Fantasy and LitRPG. A genre we haven't had on Worlds Asunder yet. So we thought it'd be a good time to have you guys on to kind of discuss some of the finer points of world building when it comes to that and how it might differ from like traditional fantasy. So kind of my first question to both of you is, can you define Progression Fantasy and LitRPG for us?
Yeah. Progression fantasy is a subset of the fantasy genre in which you are constantly growing or elevating your power in some way, either cultivating it or gaining magical objects or experience or just mastering some sort of power. It's mostly defined by the degrees of power, constantly increasing, having levels to obtain, or titles, or plateaus of power. And a lot of the story focuses around the growth, getting more powerful. Either you've got to defeat the next young master, or you've got to defeat this next thing. If you've ever seen Dragon Ball Z, or even know what I'm talking about, Dragon Ball Z is a progression fantasy, pretty hardcore. And LitRPG is a subsect of progression fantasy in which you use numbers to showcase the growth. So it's easier to understand. If I've got a 1 strength, I can do X. But if I've got a 2 strength, I'm now stronger than I was before. So it's a very logical way to keep track of your growth. A lot of LitRPG uses level ups like in video games, but sometimes they just use like generic stat sheets and leveling up each of your stats in order to do something very amazing. So, John, you want to add anything to that?
Nope.
John's like, you nailed it.
Then we got it.
Also, he loves you.
Oh yeah, I love John too. He's my soulmate. Look at his little face.
I read it in
How are
his
you guys
bio.
not falling in love with him right now?
I'm taken. I'm very taken.
We love you both. That's the real thing there.
Yeah, you guys are great.
So then, John, I guess to kind of throw this into your court, would you say the main difference or the only difference between LitRPG and progression fantasy is just the number crunching?
Pretty much. Technically speaking, I don't think I've ever seen it done, but I have heard an interesting argument that a LitRPG would not have to be a part of progression fantasy because you could have a system with numbers where people did not ever get better, but you still had numbers representing their capabilities. But why you would ever do that, I don't know, and I don't believe it has ever been done. So I would say that functionally it is entirely a subset contained within progression fantasy. In both cases, you're dealing with a hard magic system, but I guess LitRPG is the hardest of hard magic systems because it's right there with numbers. I mean, I've seen people that, not literally, but borderline invent just a new physics, like very complicated math to explain the world and stuff like that. So, but it's always in service of the progression when I've ever seen it done, and progression itself is usually in service of the story.
Gotcha. Are there other subgenres that exist kind of inside these?
I'm most known for doing what's called dungeon core. You had mentioned earlier asking about tropes. Dungeon core is more tropey than romance. It has an extremely formulaic procedure to it. It is always, I've never seen it done as a non lit RPG to some degree. Now I've seen it done as a very light lit RPG where there's very few numbers, but I've never seen it done without having some form of numerical system attached to it. So I believe it would be a complete subset of lit RPG. But it's always the same. Somebody becomes a little rock or stone or something like that and builds a dungeon around them using a mathematical system about how much power, what creatures cost, etc., in order to defend themselves or something else from attackers. It's pretty extraordinarily formulaic, and it's a small subset within lit RPG, which itself is a relatively small subset within progression fantasy. And there's others I could name. Harem lit RPG is a distinct subcategory with its own rules on how you write it and stuff. It also uses subsets that other categories use, like isekai or portal fantasy, depending on how you're defining it exactly, where you go across, normal person to another magical world. System apocalypse is, I believe, always lit RPG definitionally, which is the idea behind it is what if the magical world came here, but it was numerically represented, so everybody was suddenly the whole world was essentially inside of a computer game, but the world then exploded. And it has its own rules and tropes and things like that, but there are quite a few subsets, even within the subset of LitRPG, much less within progression fantasy. Shami mentioned it, but cultivation is a very specific way to tell an almost Eastern themed method of progression within the progression fantasy subgenre that is almost never done as a LitRPG. I have seen it done as LitRPG, but almost never done. So there's an absolute, I mean, I don't know. I feel like most people would not want to delve into the finer details of it, but as somebody that's pretty deep in it, I'm pretty excited about all the weird subgenres. And most people understand when I toss out phrases that most humans wouldn't understand, but the other authors, it tells you a lot. Just if I say system apocalypse, you already know 9 or 10 or 11 elements of the story instantaneously. So,
Well, in fact, I mean, that is part of why we have the podcast, is to get into some of those finer details. Because like we're expecting most of our audience to be newer authors, or maybe authors who've been around for a little bit but are looking to kind of upgrade their storytelling. And from what I can tell, your statement, John, about how like as you throw out some of those subgenres, a lot of people who write already in that genre overall know exactly what you're talking about. But for people like me, who I haven't delved a whole lot into that genre, like I kind of have an idea from the outside looking in, but some of it, like to me, seems the same, and some of it is very not the same. But that kind of leads us to the follow-on, since each of the subgenres has their own tropes. Where do you guys start when you go to kind of pick the story that you're going to write? Do you start with kind of the tropes you want to hit, or do you start with, a world setting or character? Where is it that you guys typically start when you build your different stories out?
Very different for the two of us. I know Shami's going to answer, and it's going to be an entirely different answer.
Perfect.
We talk about this a lot. So I exclusively write LitRPG. I only write number-based stories, and my brain is deeply attracted to math. Okay, and I sometimes, about twice a year, have an epiphany where my brain suddenly invents an entirely new game system just for the hell of it. Okay. I don't know how to explain it beyond that. Usually something triggers it, like the last one, the most recent one that I developed that's been fully turned into a book, was somebody asked me to work out a card game system for them. And when they were explaining what they wanted, I suddenly realized that they were wrong. I know that sounds like strange. And I developed an entirely different card system, but it never would have happened if they hadn't talked to me about it. And it was refined with discussions with Shami about how to make a math system serve a story, because she's a far better storyteller than I am. But I always have this moment where I see a system, and then I try to build a story around it. And half the time, it's not even my own story. Half the time, I sort of convert a story I'm very familiar with into something else. Quite a few people know this, but Demon Card Enforcer I had a system. It was fascinating and interesting, and I had these cool cards that I wanted and all this cool magic, and I loved it. And I didn't really have a story, but Shami had a story I really liked from her early days before she was, a hugely successful author. And so I just asked her permission to sort of retell the story. And I had to do a pretty substantial rewrite because there was one or two points that people didn't like as much in my genre. But even now, the story bears a quite a high level of similarity to the story she originally told. My very first book is a rewriting of another Dungeon Core author's book. I mean, it's extremely rewritten, but I got most of the ideas from reading their stuff and thinking I wanted this to happen instead. And so I basically wrote their story, but then changed one or two very key plot points and then wrote in a different direction because frankly, I was angry that they blew up their world and started from zero. I wanted to tell the story where the world didn't blow up and it just kept going. But for me, it always starts with a mathematical system, and I build the story later. So I'm never thinking, what tropes do I want? Except that when I write Dungeon Core, there are certain tropes. It's not even just a trope. There's like a story outline that is followed 85% of the way through every single story. Little Gem is born. Gem discovers how to use its powers in a very alien way because it's not a person. Gem eventually meets its dungeon fairy, which is almost always the opposite gender of the gem. That's the person that it talks to. Gem builds its first little monsters and dungeon. Adventures happen in. It's almost always the good adventurers the first time, the one that are going to be the cool people. It learns and has to redo its dungeon. Adventuring party is trying to become famous because of the dungeon and gain power. They grow together. Eventually, some huge threat materializes and tries to destroy the dungeon gem. Dungeon and adventuring party team together and defeat the threat. That's book one of every single Dungeon Core you read. It just is. Okay, it's more formulaic than romance books.
I didn't think that was possible.
Yeah, but book 2 and on. Well, so I know this is going to sound strange, but I don't like romance at all. But I don't blame it for being formulaic. It's just because it's a formula I don't like. The Dungeon Core, again, it's even more formulaic, but it's a formula I like, so I get really excited about it. But other than that, I don't really ever start with a trope. I end with a trope. Like I start with the system, I build a world, and only then do I really put the story together and the tropes that I'm going to use. But again, I know that when Shami answers you, it's going to be an entirely different thought process.
Now I have questions about Dungeon Core. I'm going to write this down.
Go ahead, Shami.
So I always start with the ending in mind. Every story I ever write, whether it's progression fantasy or not. The thing about progression fantasy is that usually the endings are extremely bombastic because this is the very end of a power growth set. I mean, in one of my... It's a joke in the progression fantasy subgenre that you will end your series by fighting God, because that's the very highest power set that you could possibly get to. And it's a joke. It's, mildly true because that's what happens. Even in my series that basically, it's like inspired from Pokemon. I have mythical creatures, right? Like unicorns, dragons, all that other kind of stuff. But then I have a subset of creatures that are god creatures. So in mythology, creatures that are just, cuckoo, kachoo, like the world serpent. Those types of creatures, which are, either create things, are too gigantic to just be a normal creature that roams around. And the end of my series has all of the god creature arcanists fighting each other because, of course, that's the end of a progression fantasy. You want the strongest of the strongest fighting the other strongest of the strongest. If that's not how your progression fantasy ends, you've done it incorrectly. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that's what we're all here for, really. It's ever escalating fights. The book series. That's mostly what progression fantasy is. Again, if you've ever seen an episode of Dragon Ball Z. So it's really fun to start progression fantasies off with people who are at the very bottom of said progression. So in my Pokemon style thing, the main character is an orphan. He works as a grave digger. He doesn't have a mystical creature. He longs for the day in which he can have a mystical creature and it'll be cool. And then we end the series with everybody with their god creatures fighting each other. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the story arc. That's basically the story arc for all progression fantasy. And it's fun because you really like to see that weak to strong progression. Everybody really wants to see the kid that was down on his luck, who now isn't down on his luck anymore because he's got all the magic and he's going to smash your face because you were evil and you made fun of him that one time. Like it's that kind of wish fulfillment and that kind of fun storytelling.
So I'm curious, you talk about how people like when the stories culminate in like these giant battles. Do you have any tips for how to make these smaller battles in your earlier books engaging for fans who are ultimately hoping for that like massive payoff at the end?
So what I tell everybody about fight scenes is that it's not really about the fight. It's about the consequences of the fight. Little fights can be very, very tense and on the edge of your seat if there's a lot going on that doesn't have to do with the fight. So main character in my very first book, when he's teeny tiny arcanist, no god power, right? The final conflict in that book is he has to fight his all-time hero. So he really admires Gregory Ruma. He thinks he's the best guy ever. He's the hero of heroes. Main character wants to be just like Gregory Ruma because it's just that cool. But in the book, Gregory Ruma is infected with the arcane plague and he's driven mad and starts murdering people. And so main character has to fight him to stop him. But it's bittersweet or sad because main character looked up to this guy, right? Like this was the dude you've always wanted to be. It's like admiring Michael Jordan and then you have to murder Michael Jordan. You know what I'm saying? It's not the best analogy, but that's the kind of thing. The emotional impact of the fight is what we're here for, not necessarily, the fight. Obviously, the fight was cool. I'm not going to say it wasn't cool, but it's more about the ramifications, the emotions behind it. So little fights are really great when there's a lot happening outside of the fight, theoretically. Fighting to save somebody, you know what I'm saying? Like a tiny fight where you fight a bunch of people because they're harming that little kid, that they're hustling and whatnot. You gotta save that little kid. Those types of things. I feel like a fight that's just a fight to be a cool fight isn't like that great. It's not that awesome. It's borderlines on being filler, unless you just want to show off your main character being cool or have a new cool power, but. Yeah, if it's going to be a cool fight, it's just the outside ramifications.
Kind of makes me think of some of the filler episodes from Naruto.
Yeah, you got it. Naruto is pretty classic progression fantasy too. So,
right. Well, that's that's been my problem is trying to understand progression fantasy. Like, I watched a ton of anime growing up, right? I watched Dragon Ball Z, I watched Naruto, and then, we kind of talked about it a little bit beforehand. Like, I had read stuff now that could probably fit into soft progression fantasy, but that was the closest I ever got. So, like, trying to talk to people about it, sometimes I'm like, I get this, I get this, I get this. I don't understand everything, but let me try.
Also, I'm going to go totally off track for a second. John, you were talking about Dungeon Core, which I am completely unfamiliar with. Little gem, what is the POV that is primarily written from, and how does that change how you write?
So 90% of Dungeon Cores are written from a dual POV. They're written from the point of view of both the dungeon, which is the little gem, and the head of the good guy adventuring party. Okay.
So what does the dungeon POV look like? I find that fascinating.
So most people that read Dungeon Core usually read it and read, like, if they like it at all, they usually read like 30 or 40 and then they just drop it forever, because the POV being fascinating, I think, is actually the biggest sell for for the Dungeon Core. Like, Shami to this day says that the early point of view of the first Dungeon Core she wrote, or that I wrote, is probably her favorite of my writing, just because it was so different and so alien. It starts as basically a baby with superpowers trying to learn to use its superpowers. Okay? It doesn't have the ability to do anything we would normally think of, like walk or talk, but technically it has, at some limited ability, all of those, like the capability to move itself, but it has to learn to do it differently. So the usual thing is it can eat and extrude matter, but doing so costs energy, and it only generates a certain amount of energy per time. Okay, so when it's first born, it's usually stuck in the ground or something like this, and it has to learn to carve a cave out around it, and eventually carve a tunnel out to the surface, and then creatures come in to to deal with it. It learns to make new creatures, and it almost always is something small and funny to start with. The most famous dungeon core is uses bunnies as its opening creature, but it injects magical energy into the bunnies. So for the first couple levels, it's ever escalating powers of bunnies. Like the first bunnies are basically just a little bigger, and they have like a hard ridge on their head, and so they like run and smash into the legs of adventurers. But they obviously can barely do anything, and they're more silly than whatnot. But eventually, they end up with like little golden bunnies that can heal the other bunnies, and bunnies that are like the size of cows that can leap through the air and then smash you, and bunnies that have like demonic energy through like a horn in their head that can stab you and infect you, and all this kind of stuff. And how it gets there, it takes most of the story. It's progression fantasy itself as this dungeon learns to make these things. Eventually, by the end of the book, they say Shami says the goal of every progression fantasy is to fight God. Most dungeon cores, the goal is to become God. Like, I know that sounds a little similar because if you beat God, you would be God, but you kind of become a stationary God. You're just like an entire metropolis with thousands of creatures controlled by you running around inside of it. Mine literally gets its sphere of influence into towns and cities and can start altering them and building them and giving magical items to the people and stuff like that. Technically, my most well-known dungeon core is, I describe it as, because every dungeon core has a theme, like something about it that makes it a little different. I call them theme parks because they're all the same story, and what you're really there for is to see the cool, different dungeon. Like you went to Disneyland and went to the Star Wars ride, or you went to Adventure Island, or you went to, Six Flags at the other park and did like the roller coasters. It's just a different theme. Mine is economics. Like, I know it sounds weird, but my dungeon's conceit is it doesn't give out loot in the usual sense, like a magical axe. It gives out resources, and I spend a lot of time in my books talking about the economics of a fantasy kingdom and how you would use magical resources to grow more things and to sort of achieve an agricultural revolution, an industrial revolution, etc., based purely on magic. But my dungeon eventually grows to be tens of miles in every direction. Can warp the entire land, make it more productive. It builds drainage ditches and things like that. Like it, but it starts as a tiny little alien baby that has to learn to do the tiniest of its powers and eventually grows to become, almost Cthulhian. Not really, because it still has a human thought pattern to a certain degree, but it's a non-human entity. It's really rather large. There's a game called Dungeon Keeper. And this was the original idea that people got for this is the Dungeon Keeper's joke is you play the bad guy and the good heroes eventually come to try to take over. And what you do is you build a dungeon that it's like reversed. Because normally when you play an RPG, you're the good guys and you go into a dungeon and defeat the evil monster. Well, in this one, you play the evil monster and it's like funny. They have like, succubuses that like to be in bondage and stuff like that. It's not as sexual as that sounds, but it's very obvious. It's got like goblins that run around screaming "Yes, master," and you can make them work faster by slapping them with your magical hand that does things. It's very over the top fun, I guess. But the idea is you're the bad dungeon building something, and that's what Dungeon Core really is. And the point of view is this person learning to use their powers, learning to build a dungeon, and eventually becoming, the heart of an entire country or economy or something like that that's basically untouchable.
I think that's super cool. I just added a bunch of stuff to my TBR, I think.
Well, if you're going to do it, read The Divine Dungeon first, but I should warn you, it is very much not for everybody. But The Divine Dungeon is it's widely considered the single best example of dungeon core out there.
And the fantasy world one you were talking about, that was your Elf Empire, correct?
No, Corrupted Core is the series. It's Corrupted Core,
Gotcha.
Entropic Core, Warring Core.
Oh, yeah. Okay, gotcha. There it is.
Yeah, I can't remember Forgotten Core is the last one.
Yep.
Technically, it's supposed to be a 5-book series that I've never finished. We just won't talk about that. But there was a point in time when I think it was probably the third or fourth most popular Dungeon Core series. Enough's come out that it's probably 6th or 7th at this point, but it's a pretty well-known Dungeon Core. I think it's slightly still my best-selling series, although the Demon Card Enforcer has come pretty close. Elf Empire's come pretty close. Oh, whoops.
Nice.
Sorry, I keep trying
Oh,
to mute and unmute myself because Shami and I will reverb if we don't. But I accidentally hit the cam button instead of the mic.
He's like, I'm out. I said my piece. A little later.
Welcome to the end of part 1 of Gotta Get Stronger. We hope you enjoyed listening to kind of a newer genre. And for those of you who are wondering what the difference is between LitRPG, Progression Fantasy, all of its subgenres and game lit and all that jazz, hopefully you learned a few or maybe picked out some of the gems that John and Shami dropped on us. I thought it was really interesting that Dungeon Core is more tropey than romance, but having not read a ton of both, I don't know really what I'm talking about there. So I'm glad we had John on to talk about it. Thanks for stopping by. Make sure you go check out our links in the show notes. You can follow all of us wherever you find our links. Make sure to tune in 2 weeks for Gotta Get Stronger Part 2 with John and Shami Stovall. And don't worry, this one turned into a 3-parter. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, thanks for helping us tear the world's asunder. We'll see you next time.